Okay. Good evening, guys. I know this is sporadic and this is probably random. However, since I joined Dr. Cadell's last course on Hegel, I will try to link all his. I'll try to link the stuff about his course on the YouTube channel. Hopefully, if I'm not too much of a barbarian caveman, someone that doesn't know anything about technology. Hopefully, I can link all that stuff. Cadell, if you're watching this, if you can link it, that'd be nice too. But of course, the onus is on me because I am making this video. So the reason why I'm doing this video again is to kind of just have some hold myself to uh, social, social. I don't know, social pressure. There's many people that do this, uh, especially in Davud's reading group, um, where there's one particular individual that he will just read on with the camera on. So this is to I think just to create some I don't know the term, some anyway, some type of responsibility. Let's just put it that way. But anyways, I'm going to try to do. I'll try to make a specific section in my YouTube channel where I just do the daily read-alongs. Uh, and anybody that is in Cadell's course, if they want to watch these videos and read along with me, because they feel that maybe they won't be able to hold themselves accountable, you can, you can. But primarily, this will be to hold myself accountable. And so on. So let's begin. Let's go into it. This is gonna be great. This is gonna be heavy stuff. All right, but it's the foreword, so maybe it's not that bad. All right, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the foreword by J.N. Findlay. Findlay. Anyways, the phenomenology of spirit, first published in 1807, is a work seen by Hegel as a necessary forepiece to his philosophical system, as later set forth in the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in outline of 1817, 1827, 1830. But it is meant to be a forepiece that can be dropped and discarded once the student, through deep immersion in its contents, has advanced through confusions and misunderstanding to the properly philosophical point of view. Its task is to run through, in a scientifically purged order, the stages in the mind's necessary progress from immediate sense consciousness to the position of a scientific philosophy, showing thereby that this position is the only one that the mind can take when it comes to the end of the intellectual and spiritual adventures described in the book. But this sort of history, he tells us in Encyclopedia 25, I guess that means paragraph 25, I don't know, uh, necessarily had to drag in, more or less out of place, and inadequately characterize much that would afterwards be adequately set forth in the system. And it also had to bring in many motivating connections of which the adventuring mind was unaware. Which explained why it passed from one phase of experience or action to another, and yet could not be set forth in the full manner which alone would render them intelligible. Hegel also, in preparing for republication of the work before his death in 1831, wrote a note which throws great light on his death. I mean, never mind. which throws great light on his ultimate conception of it. It was, he writes, a peculiar earlier work, which ought not to be revised, since it related to the time at which it was written, a time at which an abstract absolute dominated philosophy. See the final paragraph of the first section of Hofmeister's appendix. I can't say that because I'm not German. In the 1952 edition. This note indicates this note indicates that while Hegel undoubtedly thought that the sequence of thought phases described in the phenomenology, phases experienced by humanity in the past and recapitulated by Hegel in his own thought adventures up to and including his own advance to the position of science in about 1805, was a necessary sequence. He still did not think it the only possible necessary sequence or pathway to science, and certainly not the pathway to science that would be taken by men in the future or that might have been taken in other cultural and historical settings. For Hegel makes plain by his practice, as well as in some of his utterances, that he does not confuse the necessary with the unique, that he does not identify a necessary sequence of phases with the only possible sequence that can be taken. Hegel was obviously familiar with the branching variety of alternative proofs, all involving strictly necessary steps that are possible in mathematics, and it is plain that he did not think that a similar branching of proofs was impossible in his dialectical reasoning. Dialectic is, in fact, a richer and more supple form of thought advance than mathematical inference. For while the latter proceeds on lines of strict identity, educing only what is explicit or almost explicit in some thought position's content, dialectic always makes higher order comments upon its various thought positions, stating relations that carry us. I lost my. Actually, maybe I can still find it. Lost my position. Okay, here it goes. Dialectic always makes higher order comments upon its various thought positions, stating relations that carry us far beyond their obvious content. What is obvious, for example, in being is not its identity with nothing, and what is obvious in sense certainty is not its total lack of determinateness. If mathematical identities can thus follow different routes to the same or to different goals, dialectical commentaries can even more obviously do the same. And Hegel in his varying treatment of the same material in the two logics and in the phenomenology shows plain recognition of this fact. A necessary connection, whether mathematical or dialectical, is not psychologically compulsive. Losing my spot for a second. Okay, is not psychologically compulsive. It represents a track that the mind may or may not take, or that it may or may not prefer to other tracks on its journey to a given conclusion. There is no reason then to think that Hegel thought that the path traced in the phenomenology, though consisting throughout of necessary steps, was the only path that the conscious spirit could have taken in rising from sensuous immediacy to absolute knowledge. It was the path that had been taken by the world spirit in past history, and that had been rehearsed in the consciousness of Hegel, in whom the notion of science first became actual. But this involved no pronouncement as to what pathway to science would be taken by men in the future, nor as to what pathway would have been taken in other thinkable world situations. For Hegel admits an element of sheerly contingent and therefore also of the sheerly possible in nature and history. The sequence of phases to be studied in the phenomenology therefore involves a fine blend of the contingently historical and the logically necessary. Its successive phases bring out what is logically implicit in its earlier phases, in the Hegelian sense of representing throughout an insightful higher order comment on previous contents, but they also only bring out a series of implications actually embodied in past history and in Hegel's own thought history. Hegel, we know, did not desire to step out of his own time and his own thought situation. The philosopher, as he was later to say on page 35 of the preface to the Philosophy of Right, is necessarily a son of his own time, and his philosophy is that time comprehended in thought. To seek to transcend one's time is only, he says, to venture into the soft element of fancy and opinion. The pathway to science taken in the future may therefore differ profoundly from the one studied in the phenomenology. It may involve many abbreviations and alternative routings. It is not, however, profitable to consider such for us empty possibilities. The path to be considered is the one actually taken in the past and terminating in the present. It is, however, for all that, a path involving necessary implications and developments which will be preserved in all paths taken in the future, and in the terminus to which these lead. For on Hegel's view, all dialectical thought paths lead to the absolute idea and to the knowledge of it which is itself. It is necessary, in considering the phenomenology, as in considering all Hegel's other writings, to stress this initial point that, though Hegel may mention much that is contingent and historical, and may refuse to break wholly loose from this, his concern is always with the Begriff. I know I'm pronouncing this wrong, or universal notion, shapes that are evinced in fact and history, and with the ways in which these align themselves and lead on to one another, and can in fact ultimately be regarded as distinguishable facets of a single all-inclusive universal or concept. For Hegel, the universal is no strengthless, arbitrary distillation of the common features of what is individual and empirical. It is rather what must be conceived as realizing itself in what is individual and empirical, and as responsible both for the being and intelligibility of the latter. But what is thus universal will not necessarily align together what are contiguous in space and history, and hence in the phenomenology, the conceptual treatment can jump widely from one factual, empirical scene to the other, from, for example, the scientific universals behind phenomena to the fellow minds which discover them in phenomena, from the antique Stoics and skeptics who entrench themselves in cognitive, cogitative, abstractive, from contingent content to the medieval devotees who located their explanatory abstractions beyond all such content, from the compassion which enables the man of conscience to forgive the sin-soiled man of action to the religious spirit which can see the divine in all men, and so on. It is also necessary to stress here that the dialectical phases, I'm going to drop my chair here a little bit, it's also necessary to stress here that the dialectical development, which Hegel sees as connecting his phenomenological phases, is a logical growth of notions out of notions given to us who consider the culture past of humanity as resumed in ourselves, but not given as a logical growth to those who, including ourselves, went through the actual cases of such notions, and not even exactly following the order of the corresponding particularizations. The mind of humanity in the past did not, for example, see the necessary logical step from the kingdom of laws behind nature to the kingdom of subjects who consider nature, nor did they in fact historically pass from the one to the other. It is we, the phenomenological students of the shapes of spirit, who see the logical connections between them, and therefore also for phenomenological purposes the order in which they must be arranged. It is important, therefore, that from the very beginning we frame viable conceptions of the logical movements our notional shapes of spirit must undergo, movements of which temporal sequences are often only inadequately and misplaced reflections. See, for example, Phenomenology, section 801, page 558. Subjectively, of course, as we have said, all these movements involve a species of reflection, a retreat to the vantage point of a higher order, and as we might now say, metalogical examination, and the consequent bringing to view of what can be truly predicated of a thought phase, though not necessarily what is meant or intended in its explicit content. Okay, I'm going to highlight that specific line. Though not necessarily what is meant or intended in its explicit content. Okay. But objectively, what are thus brought into view are other thought phases which in a very wide sense negate it or go beyond it, and which involve relations as various to the thought phase in question as being its necessary correlate or complement or opposite, or as being what is true of it, though not at all part of its content and perhaps contradicting the latter, or as being a more explicit and perfect form of what some phase obscurely prefigures, or as being some inclusive whole or unity of which the phase in question can only be an excerpt. The logical movement which the phenomenology, like the rest of the system, exhibits is throughout the logic of the side or aspect or moment of that which, while it can be legitimately distinguished in some unity, and must in fact be so distinguished, nevertheless represents something basically incapable of self-sufficiency and independence, properties which can only be attributed to the whole into which sides, aspects, or moments enter, and a reference to which is accordingly built into each such side. On Hegel's basic assumptions, negation, in a wide sense that covers difference, opposition, and reflection or relation, is essential to conception and being. We can conceive nothing and have nothing if we attempt to dispense with it. But negation in this wide sense always operates within a unity, which is not as such divisible into self-sufficient elements, but is totally present in each and all of its aspects, and we conceive nothing and have nothing if we attempt to dispense with this unity. This unity, in a sense, negates the former or primary negation. It changes what, in a sense, tried to be an independent element into a mere aspect or moment. This second sort of negation is not, however, comparable to the first. It involves a reversal of direction, which does not, however, annul the primary direction that it reverses. The distinctions are still there, but only as moments and no longer as It is further in retrospect the unity which reverses the first negation, which also made the first negation possible. It is because the unity indivisibly underlies distinct sides that each such a side can acquire a certain relative self-sufficiency and independence, can after a fashion assert itself in opposition to the whole. But it is this unity also which forces the mind, and also the thing, onward from one of its one-sided aspects to another aspect necessary to its completion, and which ultimately builds all sides into a single, integrated, or reasonable totality. From the point of view of the phenomenological student, we have here a dialectical process or sequence. This is always initiated by the understanding, that seemingly marvelous faculty that is able, as it were, to segregate aspects in an indivisible whole and to endow the non-independent with a certain quasi-independence. This segregation is carried on by a dialectical phase in which other aspects then either negate, oppose, supplement, or put into necessary relation with the first segregated aspect, which then loses itself with the other aspects in a many-sided but truly indivisible whole. From the point of view of the notional phases here concerned, they grow out of and into one another, not in the derived and plural sense in which the parts of an organism grow out of one another, but rather in the primary sense in which, for example, the whole series of numbers grow out of a certain basic arithmetical, can't say, arithmetical principles. The notional integration thus indicated ends, according to Hegel, in absolute knowledge or the absolute idea, the test of whose absoluteness consists simply in the fact that nothing further remains to be taken care of. Even the contingencies and looseness of connection that obtain in the world are such as the sort of system we are constructing does and must involve. That Hegel does achieve this final integration is of course what many would dispute. There is, however, yet another sense in which the phenomenology is concerned only with notions or concepts, that is to say, with the universal shapes of spirit, and only indirectly with the individual instances of such shapes. This depends on Hegel's view that conscious spirit or subjectivity is itself exhaustively analyzable in terms of the three conceptual moments of universality, specificity, and singularity, and that it represents, in fact, merely an extreme form of these three notional functions, a severance or an alienation of them from one another, which is, of course, inseparable from their fruitful and necessary coming together. For Hegel does not believe in the subject as being some detached substantival entity standing in varying relations to other substantival entities which are its objects. The subject is, as said in Encyclopedia, the active or self-active universal, the universal the universal in a peculiar form in which it distinguishes itself from what is specific and individual, from what is perhaps given sensibly, and yet goes forth from itself and interprets and controls what thus confronts it objectively. In doing so, moreover, it makes its objects its own and is thereby enabled to return to self and to achieve consciousness of self. Um, the thinking ego is further in another place, closely connected, in fact, identified much as by Kant in the transcendental deduction with the category or categories used in the synthetic constitution of objects, by the understanding, and at the end of the phenomenology, the conceptualization of all objects and their subjection to universals is not seen as different from the imposition on them of the form of self. The subject or the subject or ego is thus for Hegel not what we ordinarily understand by a personal thinker, but the logical function of universality in a peculiar sort of detachment from its species and instances. I'm going to highlight that one. The mind for Hegel, as for Aristotle, is thus the place of forms, a bustling agora where such forms are involved in endless transactions and conversations, and though it is by the indeterminate and though it is by the intermediation of such forms that there is a reaching out to their individual instances, they none the less enjoy a relative independence there, a detachment in the thought ether, that they never enjoy elsewhere. Universals, of course, on Hegel's view, enjoy a sunken, implicit existence in natural objects, and they also enjoy some sort of being beneath the surface of natural objects, as the essences or forces which explain them. They are also in the logic given as having a status as pure essentialities, or as notional shadows without sensuous concretion, in some sense prior to the existence of nature and finite spirit. But, however much universals and that universal of all universals, the idea, may exist apart from subjects in any ordinary sense of the latter. The fact remains that they achieve their full development and truth in the self-consciousness of spirit, in which all universal patterns of logical and natural being are reactivated and resumed. Oops. The life, then, of conscious spirit, whether in the phenomenology of spirit or the latter philosophy of spirit, is arguably only a series of phases in which one or other of the moments of the notion is detached as subjective from the rest, which are thereby extruded into objectivity, and which are then again reintegrated with the moments remaining in the subject, again extruded and again reintegrated in an endlessly developing rhythm. Those who know Hegel well and are aware of the profound connections of the phenomenology with the later system, which is in fact all there in the general writings. That's a weird sentence for me. Which is in fact all there in the general writings, will know how mistaken are all those who think of the phenomenology as merely a contribution to existential phenomenology, to which the later system is largely irrelevant. From first to last, Hegel conceived everything in terms of the self-active Begriff and idea, and his thought is as remote from the personally concerned thought of the existentialist as from that of the grandiose superpersonal ego of Fichte. These types of thought can, of course, be found encapsulated in Hegel if one likes to look for them, since he includes what he transcends and even includes what he will transcend once his uh, epigony have formulated it. Compare, for example, his dialectical anticipations of Mill's views on induction and of the logical atomism of Wittgenstein and Russell. But what Hegel brings in as a phase in an ongoing dialectic is not, of course, his last word on a subject. One more word before we begin our introductory survey of the actual content of the phenomenology, since the phenomenology studies a particular path from immediate sense experience to all grasping Wissenschaft, which is also the path still distilled in Hegel's experience from the previous experiences of the world spirit. There will be much in that path that would be illuminated by knowledge of the personal history of Hegel. We ought to know why he was impressed by certain notional entailments and affinities and not by others. In part, we do not have considerable light on this topic. We understand, for example, how the love between him and his sister Christina caused him to stress the role of sisters in ethical life. We understand his interest in the Antigone from his schoolboy studies at Stuttgart, and we understand his interest in the French Enlightenment and Revolution from the provincial position of continental Germany. Both his historical phases counted for much less in Britain. There are also difficult allusions in his treatment of the unhappy consciousness which Rosencrantz convincingly illuminated, but there remains much in the phenomenology which is enigmatic, and one cannot always see why the route to absolute knowledge should wind through just these peculiar thickets. Hegel was in fact a writer of literary genius, and one swayed in his choice of words by a burgeoning unconscious. Once he departed from the dispersing atmosphere of Bern and Frankfurt, and ceased writing such relatively dull, much overstudied writing as he produced there. An afflatus seized him in the Jena lecture rooms. An afflatus, I'm pronouncing this word wrong, I know it, perhaps unique in philosophical history, which affected not only his ideas but his style, and which makes one at times only sure that he is saying something immeasurably profound and important, but not exactly what it is. I am in this position despite help regarding the two intelligible worlds in the section on force and understanding. To comment on Hegel fully, would therefore require the same sort of psychological and metapsychological treatment that has long been practiced on an essentially rapt man like Shakespeare, or on such Gallic genius as uh, Rimbaud and Malem. Despite the sensitive work of Jean Hippolyte, we are far from having anything like a really full commentary on the phenomenology. The general remarks that I shall now make will therefore yield only a very inadequate uh, prefatory illumination. We shall begin our treatment of the phenomenology with the introduction, ignoring the beautiful and famous preface, which was in fact only added when the book was complete, and which was meant to introduce not only the phenomenology, but the whole system. The point of the introduction is simply to give a preliminary conception, justified only when the work would be complete, as to how a study of the shapes of mind leading on from one immediate experience to what claimed to be scientific knowledge could succeed in dissipating doubt as to the real possibility of the whole venture. Might not the finally corrected shape, which emerge from such a process, be as remote from things as they are in themselves are as the first, uncorrected, immediate shape? And how could the projected work abolish Kant's view that an examination of human knowledge only shows, not that such knowledge can really reach some standpoint where the absolute or the thing in itself will be accessible to it, but that this is forever and in itself impossible, that there are and must be aspects of things that we can indeed conceive negatively or perhaps have beliefs about, but of which we can never have knowledge. Hegel's criticism of this critical view of knowledge is simply that it is self-refuting, that it pronounces, even if negatively, on the relation of conscious appearances to absolute reality, while claiming that the latter must forever transcend knowledge. To this self-refuting view, Hegel opposes the view that the distinction between what things in themselves are and what things only are for consciousness or knowledge must itself be a distinction drawn within consciousness. That the former can only be the corrected view of an object, while the latter is merely a view formerly entertained but now abandoned as incorrect. I'm going to highlight that one. The progress of knowledge will then consist in the constant demotion of what appeared to be the absolute truth about the object to what now appears to be the only way that the object appeared to consciousness, a new appearance of absolute truth taking the former place. Hegel, I'm going to try to see how long the rest of this is. I think I'll stop at 40 minutes regardless. Okay. Hegel, however, assumes that this progress must have a final term, a state where knowledge need no longer transcend or correct itself, where it will discover itself in its object and its object in itself, where concept will correspond to object and object to consciousness. Such a conception might seem to go too far, for surely an endless inadequacy of knowledge to its object would not destroy all meaning and validity in such knowledge, nor would this vanish were there to be aspects of things of which, as Kant held, we could only frame negative, regulative conceptions, but of which we could never have definite knowledge. Hegel will, however, marvelously include in his final notion of the final state of knowledge the notion of an endless progress that can have no final term. For he conceives that precisely in seeing the object as an endless problem, we forthwith see it as not being a problem at all. For what? Dang, I gotta highlight that. Okay. For what the object in itself is simply to be the other, the stimulant of knowledge and practice, which in being forever capable of being remolded and reinterpreted, is also everlastingly pinned down and found out being just what it is. The implication of all this is that the teleological view of objectivity as being intrinsically destined to be interpreted and controlled by consciousness will prove, on a sufficiently deep examination, to be so wholly appeasing and satisfying that no shadow of the hidden or inexplicable will remain to haunt us. We shall then be in a fit state to investigate the essentialities of being as set forth in the logic, and the subsequent self-externalization of these essentialities in the philosophies of nature and spirit. Whether this Hegelian view of the role of the object as a mere inspirer of spiritual effort is valid may of course be questioned. There would certainly seem to be obscurities, inconsequences, and dysteleologies in our world which demoralize rather than stimulate spiritual effort. We shall not, however, consider these contemporary depressants, which Hegel, as a German romantic, could not have envisaged. The introduction, in its final paragraph, makes the further important point that the lessons that consciousness learns in its continued experience of objects are not for it a continuous course of lessons. It conceives that it is constantly passing to some new and unrelated object. I think, hold on. I don't know if I'm going to get close to finishing anytime soon. Okay. So I am not getting close to finishing anytime soon. So I will stop at this page. So I'll just finish this page right here. All right. The introduction in its final paragraphs makes a further important point that the lessons that consciousness learns in its continued experience of objects are not for it a continuous course of lessons. Ooh, gotta see this. I feel like, is this a whole sentence? I guess. are not for a continuous course of lessons. It conceives that it is constantly passing to some new and unrelated object, when it is really only seeing its previous object in some novel, critical light. It is not, for example, aware, as previously said, that the consciousness of an order of mutually conscious persons is what was implicit in the awareness of laws, forces, and other essentialities behind the phenomena of nature. It is we, the phenomenological students, who see the deep notional continuity in what is, for it, a kaleidoscope of objects. It is important in what follows that we should always distinguish between the actual transitions occurring in conscious experience and the logical transitions that the phenomenologist elicits from these latter. In Section A on consciousness, Hegel explores three relations of conscious subjectivity to its object: the sense certainty, which merely confronts an object in what seems to be its rich individuality without making anything definite of it; the perception, where it begins to distinguish properties or qualities in the immediately given, but it is unable to integrate them in the unity of the perceived thing; and finally, the understanding, where the natures of things are seen as fixed patterns of mutual inter- inter- interference and interaction behind their manifest phenomenal surface. Sense certainty is dialectically flawed by its claim to qualitative richness and individual immediacy, since it is impossible to pin down the qualities which are thus felt to be rich and various, or the individuality which is thus to be wholly unique. For in the flux of experience, one quality is constantly yielding place to another, and it is impossible to seize what is individual by pointing gestures or by demonstrative words, such as this, here, now, I, etc. Okay, I will stop here. Um, and that was a that was a good reading. I think that was very good. It already gives me a nice kind of little overview of exactly what's going to happen in the book. Um, so I'm excited for this class, Cadell. I am. All right. Take care, guys.